Hello everyone! I know it's been a little while since I posted anything, or at least since I filmed anything. I ran into some technical difficulties which delayed my videos quite a bit, and this script has been written for a while, and I'm just finally now getting around to actually filming it. It's March 5th as of right now when I'm filming this. Hopefully it'll be posted tomorrow, I'm hoping, but we'll see about that. I might run into more technical difficulties, we'll see. And I've also just been super busy with work and school. I've got final exams coming up sooner than I feel like it should be. It's just time is just flying by so quickly. Um, but yeah, I've got 10 mini album reviews here. Again, this was from a while ago, so I'm just finally getting around to it now. And at the end of the video, I'll give you a little bit of an update on where things are at with the channel and just kind of what my plan is for the rest of the year with reviews and other videos, stuff like that. But anyway, let's get right into the reviews, starting with... So here we have some post-hardcore slash emo from this American supergroup, which consists of members of many other popular bands, including Thursday, Coheed and Cambria, and My Chemical Romance. Now, I personally haven't listened to their 2022 debut album, Past Lives, but just based on some things that I read, it seems like this album is going in a much more optimistic direction, and I can certainly hear it with some of the bright guitar sounds and the happier sounding melodies. And I do think the first two tracks bring some nice intensity as well as melody, and it had this record going in an intriguing direction. But unfortunately, from there, this album just sort of starts to go downhill. With the third track, I Can See It Now, which has a much stiffer sounding drums and guitar, and the vocals aren't really placed super well in the mix, in my opinion, often getting drowned out, and it's very unflattering. That being said, I do really like the next song, Violet, which includes some chilling lyrics such as, "The moment I forgave you, I regretted it." But from this point on, I just start to feel like this project mostly blends together, and while it's mostly enjoyable while it's on, I just don't really think it'll have a lot of staying power for me. And I think it might be in large part because, for as much as Ellis Dune's playing style presents this as being a really musically heavy album, it instead sounds way more like a regular indie rock record because of some of the guitar timbres and the way the vocals are produced, and as someone who likes both styles of music, I just think it creates a little bit of an odd clash. And there are certain moments where the mastering is really shaky, most notably holograms, in which it sort of sounds like the sound is switching between sides with headphones on, even though I don't think it actually is, or at least not much, but something in the mastering makes it sound like it is, and not in a good way where it actually contributes to any sort of vibe, and it especially doesn't help that it has some of my least favorite vocals on the album, too. So overall, look, I don't think this is a bad album. I think the melodies are mostly good, not great. The vocals are hit or miss, but definitely work in certain moments. The guitar has some nice presence throughout some of this album, and even though I personally didn't find anything all that striking about the whole album lyrically, there are still some very well written lines, I'll give it that. And thus, I do think this is a decent album, worthy of a 6 out of 10 for me, but not among the best post hardcore I'm going to hear this year. At least I certainly hope not. For anyone who doesn't know, Olly Alexander is the main artist behind the famous electropop band Years and Years, who eventually became Olly's solo project, before he eventually started releasing music under his own name, with this being his debut solo studio album. Now, I can't say my expectations were super high, considering I haven't heard people say great things about Years and Years, but hey, I decided to give it a shot, and yeah, like I expected, this is really bland and really forgettable. Yeah, it's upbeat and has some energy to it, but the vast majority of these tracks just sound like bad attempts at impersonating The Weeknd, and I honestly feel like I had noticed this even if I wasn't working on my review of The Weeknd's album at the same time as working on this review. And some of these tracks are honestly a little bit embarrassing, like Dizzy, which sounds way too much like a mid-2010s Jason Derulo hit, and that is not a compliment at all. And the percussion is often really overpowering in the mix when placed in context of the rest of the mix, often completely taking away any power from the synths, which don't usually have the nicest timbres anyway, at least not for this style of lightweight dance pop, where they often just sound way too filthy. And most notably, the melodies don't stand out to me, and the grooves just aren't really here. Yeah, there are a few moments that are sorta charming, like the flashy production on Shadow of Love, and the synths are kinda nice on Miss You So Much, and Whisper in the Waves has a nice combination of melody and percussion, leading to probably my favorite song on the album. But even then, it's just not really all that special to me, or even all that good. In other words, I don't think there's a great song on this album, and while most of it is tolerable, it's really just not worth my time personally. I gave it a few listens, and that was enough for me. So I'd never heard of Journey Montana until this came out, but I saw it listed under new releases on Apple Music, and it's a pretty short album running for under half an hour, so I decided I may as well give it a shot. And I'm not sure why I listened to this a half a dozen times, because right off the bat, I didn't think this was very good, and that has not changed since then. I mean, you know it's a bad sign when someone starts an album by casually mentioning drinking and driving in the opening track. She does this a few songs later, too. And that's not the only questionable line on this album. I mean, on the third track, she says, "I've been feeling kinda spicy, call me ISIS." What? Anyway, bad one liners aside, there isn't much here that I find is really worth talking about. The songwriting is really bland, the lyrics about her come up feel like things we've all heard a billion times before, and it's not even like the production is usually all that flattering in my opinion, but not even in a way that I find particularly interesting, usually just certain elements overpowering the mix. Yeah, there are a few decent hooks, like in Poster Girl and You, but outside of that, I don't think this has much to offer. Yeah, Journey Montana is a very capable singer, but I'd love to hear her try a different style of music. I feel like her vocals would sound great on a rock album, or at least something more interesting than this. But as it is, I don't think I can go higher than a 5 out of 10 on this. This was really disappointing, and I didn't even know what to expect going into it. Unrequited is the solo black metal project of William Melsness, who's been releasing music under this name for a while now. By the way, I hope I pronounced his real name correctly. I think that's probably it, but I'm not sure. Anyway, this is my first time listening to one of his albums, and I did have fairly high expectations considering some things I've heard about this project, especially from one of my favorite music critics. And while I'm still curious to check out his 2021 album, I've heard some great things about that one, I wasn't as wowed by this as I was hoping to be. And on my first couple of listens to this album in the background, I sort of thought this was going to really click for me a lot. And I don't know, to a certain extent it does. I do like a lot of what Unrequited here is doing melodically, and the mixing is really good. But I also do kind of just wish this were more of a full-on black metal album, as the djent elements don't really hit that hard. Which brings me to talking about the production. Yeah, I mentioned that the mixing sounds really good, at least in terms of the volume comparisons of the instruments. But I'm not always a huge fan of the vocal effects, which often just leave this feeling more artificial than it probably should. It works some of the time, such as the Starforger, where its specific vocal processing highlights the emotion, especially when the guitar melody and the chord progression combine to create such a gorgeous soundscape, and it's probably my favorite track here. But overall, it does often create a weird feeling of disconnect between the vocals and the instrumentation, and I just don't think it fully works. Now, lyrically, this isn't the easiest album to untangle, but it doesn't seem super cryptic either. I think it's pretty clearly got something to do with the science of matter and wondering what happens to us when we die, but beyond that, I'm not totally sure if there's a main message or anything in particular that this album represents. But I do still quite like a lot of the writing, where it almost seems to be portraying everything in the universe as all being one. And with such layered instrumentation and some of the vocal layering, it certainly fits the tone. But I also can't say this completely blew my mind or anything. It is a very good album that has enough going for it that I'd probably even call it great, which is why for now this is getting a light 8 out of 10. But I just wish there were a little more consistency to the sound. Still quite impressive sonically, and again, I like a lot of what's going on in the lyrics, but I'm certainly hoping and expecting to hear better black metal this year. Solo, if you're looking for some sentimental black metal that doesn't pull too much of the heartstrings, I mean, yeah, it's worth a shot. Alright, so this one's gonna be shorter than you're probably expecting for an album this critically acclaimed. Oklou is a French electronic music producer who also provides vocals on her own songs and has been getting a lot of critical acclaim for this debut album. And this is my first time hearing about her, even though apparently she's been getting some buzz for a while. But anyway, I was feeling mostly optimistic going into this, considering it's probably one of the most acclaimed albums of the year thus far. In fact, a lot of the acclaim that I was expecting to see thrown at the new Squid album ended up going toward this instead. And by the way, I'll talk about the Squid album in my next mini-review video. And after a half dozen listens or so, I kind of get why, and I'm also not really loving this album myself. It's a sort of experimental electronic album which aims for a particular vibe, maybe a night driving album, or at least something in that vein. And I think it succeeds at that, with the sort of dancey grooves that don't completely overpower you. But unfortunately, I'm just not as big a fan of the vocals, and the production, while not bad, doesn't really feel all that unique, and there aren't a lot of standout melodies or hooks. There are some cute moments with some unique lyrical ideas, and the synths do have some nice presence to them that help with the tone of these songs. But I just don't think I'm going to remember much of this outside of the Underscores collab Harvest Sky. That song actually has been on repeat for me quite a bit in the weeks since I originally wrote this. It's not a bad album, but I think I'm going to have to give it a 6 out of 10 for just not really having a lot of replay value for me. I mean, we'll see, but I don't think I'm going back to this much. Here's a band I may have heard of before, I honestly can't remember, but I hadn't really listened to them until I heard this new album, and I still haven't heard their 2022 debut. Now, the reception to both of their albums have been mostly positive, but not amazing, and as a fan of punk music, I was definitely curious to listen to this album. And yeah, I get why it's getting a lot of acclaim. Most of the lyrics were unavailable when I tried to find them, so this review will mostly be about how the album sounds, but it does sound really good. I like a lot of the guitar work, the drumming gives this some nice rhythms, and the grooves are pretty strong, but it also just doesn't feel unique enough to really stand out to me. Yeah, there are some catchy moments, but a lot of it just feels like a typically critically acclaimed punk album where it's very good and well performed, but I just don't really notice as much personality as I do in my favorite punk music. I like the terrifying "Smells Like Something Died in Here," and the opening track sets up the second track really well, and the vast majority of this is impressive, but I just don't think I'll be returning to it much. I'll give it a 7 out of 10 though, at least it was enjoyable while it was on. I've been hearing the name Sharon Van Etten for a while now, but I'm pretty sure this is the first one of her albums that I've actually listened to. It's also the first album credited to her band The Attachment Theory. Kind of, because that's only in the title of the album, which I'm pretty sure is credited to Sharon Van Etten herself. But whatever, all that aside, I wasn't really sure what to expect going into this. I think I've heard a little bit of her music, and I don't remember being all that intrigued. And this album hasn't been getting a ton of acclaim, so my expectations weren't too high. But still, I expected a decent indie rock album, and whoa, this was a lot better than I was expecting. It's a kind of indie rock that is actually daring to add more details beyond just basic grooves and melodies, without sacrificing those fundamentals. And Sharon Van Etten's vocals across this album are fantastic, especially in the context of these songs and the production, which by the way sounds rock solid. Possibly the biggest standout to me here was Idiot Box, which I would call a post-punk song, with the sort of groovy guitar and drum combo that reminds me of Joy Division a little bit, except with the complete opposite sort of feeling to it where this is way brighter without all the doom and gloom, especially with those beautiful synths, which just highlight the sense of freedom from voicing your opinion and making yourself valuable to the greater good. And after reading the heartbreaking yet simultaneously heartwarming story that inspired Afterlife, I think it adds a context to that song which is hard to ignore. There's also Trouble, which discusses changing the beliefs you present to avoid conflict with certain people, and the false sense of freedom just shines through sonically as well, with the moody yet upbeat instrumentation. And Something Ain't Right is a simple yet effective motivational song that has some of the best instrumental development on this album. I also really dug the groovy guitars of Indio, another post-punk leaning song, with some of the best vocal production here. And Southern Life, What It Must Be Like, has something really clever where the lyrics describing her narrow worldview have basically no melodic motion, showing her feeling stuck within herself. But then when she tries to understand other perspectives and realities more, the melody changes a bit. I'm about 90% sure this was intentional. Now, outside of the tracks I mentioned, there's still a lot going for this album. The lyrics are sweet, the melodies are here and make these songs enjoyable, and like I mentioned, the vocals are really strong. I think as a whole project, it's not necessarily the most unique project I've ever heard, but there are enough moments that are bursting with creativity that I can't help but love this record. I'm feeling like an 8 out of 10 is apt for this album, and I might actually have to check out more of Sharon Van Etten's albums. I'm not sure how much potential this really shows, or how much it makes me expect her other albums to be really good, because it's hard to say, but it is a great album that I expect to be going back to quite a bit, and I'm absolutely thrilled that I gave it a chance. If you're a fan of indie rock, definitely check this one out. This is really, really good. This is the third album by Benjamin Booker, and only the first one that I've listened to. Now, there's a lot going on in this album, and I didn't give it a ton of attention, I'll admit that, even though I've listened to it over half dozen times. So just take what I say with a grain of salt, which I can probably say about all these reviews, honestly. But unfortunately, I didn't really find this one all that interesting. I feel like I didn't understand the lyrics as much as I was supposed to, but there are still some interesting lyrical moments, one of the positive things that I can say about this album. LWA in the Trailer Park, or Law in the Trailer Park, I'm not sure how to say that, I think makes a bit more sense to me when I read the story that inspired it, seeming to show someone detached from reality and only focused on himself, although it's quite cryptic and hard to figure out, so I could be totally wrong. And New World feels like a bit of a main character energy track, which I actually think fits really well with the instrumentation because I don't really take it seriously. But musically, this album just doesn't really have a lot to offer in my opinion. I saw some opinions online about this being very unique, and I personally just don't really hear it, especially in moments that feel specifically like they're imitating another artist. Most notably, Rebecca Latimer Felton takes a BBC, which feels like a blatant attempt at a Radiohead song. And then there's a song like Show and Tell, which I just find a little bit cringy, and it sounds like a bad 2010s alternative hit, but maybe a slightly more experimental version of that sound. So overall, I just didn't totally vibe with this. It's not bad, and the mixing is pretty solid, but I'm just gonna have to give it a 6 out of 10. Not really my cup of tea. So I was looking at new music releases, and I saw that Flipturn had a new album. I definitely heard of them before. I'm pretty sure one of my friends recommended a song of theirs to me a while ago, but I don't really remember that super clearly. But anyway, I decided I may as well check out this new album of theirs, and it's a frustrating listen because, well, this style of music is one that I've never fully figured out how to label. It's a sort of kooky, bouncy, often fairly lightweight pop music, which also feels very destined to cross over onto the alternative charts. And that kind of music can work when there's enough charm, but if there isn't, it can get really obnoxious really quickly. And I don't think this album is bad, not even close. But it's one that does a lot really well, and what's frustrating about it is that I feel like it should be so much better, but it's just too inconsistent. Now, this is a much more emotional album than I usually hear in this style of music, and I think that's to the album's benefit. I really like the lyrics of Sunlight, which lead singer Dylan Bass wrote about his mother going into rehab and the impact that this whole situation has had on the family. And Moon Rocks has some really beautiful writing, which I think leaves quite a bit open to interpretation, and the big musical explosion in this track is really powerful and really gorgeously layered. And I also like some of the more upbeat moments, like the opening track Juno, which is a love letter to the band's touring band, and it's got really nice production that highlights the warm feeling of comfort. And I like the melodies on this track too. And I can't not mention Rodeo Clown, which is probably my favorite song on the album, as not only do the drums combine super well with everything else to create a very low-key dance track that doesn't lose its groove, but the lyrics are both funny and serious at the same time, and it's so goddamn charming. And I also feel like mentioning the really strong vocal performance on Reason to Pretend, which is super well produced, and the guitar on this track reminds me a lot of Pedestal by Citizen, a really good track from their 2021 album, and this song might be better. But there are some moments that just don't really work for me and completely throw off the pacing of the album, and I think it might be that the band is trying to do a bit too much here. The best songs in this album show the band finding their identity, or at least a specific sound, even if it isn't the most unique style ever. But when they do use that sound to create good hooks and good grooves, I don't really care that it's not groundbreaking because it's a ton of fun to listen to. But unfortunately, I just don't think this fully sticks the landing, and while I like variety on albums, it doesn't totally work for me on this particular one for whatever reason. Also, on a bit of a side note, I have mixed opinions on whether or not Dylan's Tom York impression throughout this album works. I keep going back and forth on that. I'll still give this a 7.5 out of 10 because I do think it's really good, but I really wish I thought it was great. Alright, to end these reviews, final one for the video, the new album from Anna B. Savage, the third album by Anna B. Savage, who's an artist I'd never heard of until recently. But I saw this getting a bit of buzz with semi-positive reviews for the most part, so I decided to give it a shot. And I think it's a pretty solid singer-songwriter album. It didn't blow my mind, but the production sounds really nice. Anna is a great singer, and this, or at least in this album's best moments, the vocals are really good. And I'm not sure there's a bad track here either. I do really like the bursting instrumentation of Agnes, which also has a really good chorus, and I like the huge chorus of Donegal. Lighthouse is a really sweet tune comparing a person to a lighthouse, and the vast majority of this album is quite pleasant while it's on, I'll give it that. It's just a nice chill album to listen to when you're in the mood for something mellow. But it's also not really going to be as memorable as I was hoping. I'll give it a 7 out of 10, it's a good album, but I feel like if some of these ideas were expanded on throughout the whole album, it could have been great, but I'm still not going to complain about what we got, it's pretty good. Alright, thanks for watching. Just to give a bit of an update, again, it's March 5th as of the time that I'm filming this right now. I'm hoping to get this out tomorrow. Realistically, I don't think it'll be out today, so Thursday, March 6th, that's the goal, but it could be a while later, we'll see. I am still working on that review of Hurry Up Tomorrow by the weekend. Hopefully I'll have that out fairly soon. I've realized I'm gonna have to cut down on the albums, or the number of albums that I review. I was planning to try to review an album a day for 2025, and that's just not going to work. I might listen to that many, but also I realized, like, the less mediocre albums that I review, that means the more albums I can listen to, and if I listen to an album, you know, once or twice and decide this just isn't really for me at all and is not going to grow on me, I may as well just spend that time listening to other albums that might be better. And yeah, I'll still do reviews of albums that I don't particularly like. That's gonna happen, but I've just realized I'm not gonna get to one album review every day on average. That was what I tried to do. Maybe next year, we'll see. But just for where things are at right now, I'm starting to realize it's unrealistic. It leads to much lower quality reviews, and while I know my reviews have never been the highest quality, have never been the most in-depth. I still want to at least, maybe listen to the albums a little bit more. It always depends on the review, but for now, I'm going to probably cut back a little bit on that. For 2024 year-end lists, I've still got the top 50 best albums and top 50 best songs coming out. I think I'm going to try to, over the next few weeks, hopefully by the end of March, get the top 50 albums out. It'll probably just be a quick reading through the albums, not giving explanations, because 2024 for me wasn't really much of an album year. It was much more of an individual songs year. The individual songs stood out to me a lot more in 2024 than the albums, with a few exceptions. So yeah, I just don't really feel like putting that much effort into the 2024 albums list. It'll be very subject to change. The order is not really going to matter. I'm going to put them in an order of 50 just for tradition's sake, but please don't pay too much attention to that. We'll get to that later. I may end up even just posting it on my blog, SimonTalksMusic.com. That's where all my old reviews are. I'll probably make a video on it. We'll see. I'll figure something out. The top 50 best songs, I'm a little less sure what I'm going to do with that because I want to actually say things about them, but also that's going to take a lot of time, and I don't want to get further and further and further behind on 2025 reviews. And I actually feel like I'm reviewing enough this year and putting time into the right albums this year where I'll actually hopefully be able to get a full top 50 list. I'm preparing for my year-end lists early, so hopefully that'll all go well at the end of the year. That's what I really want to prioritize, is getting my 2025 year-end lists out on time and having them actually be decent at least. So we'll figure all that out later, but yeah, for now, thank you for watching this video. As always, these are all just my personal opinions on these albums. Feel free to let me know your opinions in the comment section down below. I'll be back with more reviews soon.